Thank you for being here on this Thursday afternoon, evening, towards the end of May, where you're maybe wrapping up the end of your school year, or it's already wrapped up and you're looking towards summer. I appreciate your time, and I'm very happy to be able to spend the time with you this afternoon or this evening. And as Sabrina said, I have a background in language teaching and linguistics and second language acquisition and bilingualism. And currently I work for Collette World Languages on our implementation team. And so my role title officially is Professional Development Coordinator. And so part of my job is to work with teachers who have adopted our materials and help them get started talking about anything from kind of how the platform works to content, to examples, to lesson planning and assessments, and kind of making sure that everything jives really well in the classroom. And I absolutely love doing that. And I'm very excited to be here with you today to talk about myths and misconceptions in communicative language teaching. And so this talk started as a talk that I gave last fall at ACTFL. And it was a kind of co-presented talk with a colleague, Dr. Trish Faulkner, who is an assistant professor of linguistics at Kalamazoo College. Kind of happy life news, she is out on maternity leave, so she couldn't be here with us today. And so the version that we're going to see is kind of an adapted, updated version from last fall with kind of some new myths, some new ideas, and some new examples. And I'm really happy to be sharing it with you. And so as we get started, what are we going to be seeing today? We're going to start off with a very brief introduction, and then we will take a look at 5 myths or misconceptions in particular, and we're going to kind of dive in a little bit into each of those. And these myths or misconceptions come from my personal teaching experiences, so things that I have experienced in the classroom, conversations that I've had or that I've been a part of or that I've witnessed. And so again, I'm very happy to share them with you, and hopefully they will resonate with you in your own experiences. And then as we go to the Q&A at the end, we'll have some time for you to share your own experiences as well. So let's go ahead and move into the presentation and get started. So as I was kind of putting this together, I thought, well, if we're going to be talking about myths and misconceptions of communicative language teaching, it might be a good idea to start maybe with some definitions and kind of talk about what communicative language teaching is to us, minimally the group of us who are going to spend this time together. And so to that end, I would like to ask you to take a second and in the chat to please kind of respond to one or both of these 2 questions that I have here for you on the screen. The first one is, what does communicative teaching mean to you? And the second one is, what does a communicative classroom look like? What might the teachers be doing in that classroom, and what might the students be doing in that classroom? So I'm going to give us kind of about 60 seconds. Please feel free, put any answers, ideas in the chat. Wonderful, I like it. We've got a lot of students using the target language, interpersonal communication, different modes of communication. Like the class is a communicative event itself. Language being used to share a message. Students' interests are important, right? So the teacher's kind of walking around, students are engaged, they're doing different activities, they're sharing ideas, opinions, experiences. It's interactive. Yeah, not only speaking, but understanding messages in the target language, partner work, real life scenarios. We've got a lot of wonderful responses and a lot of things that are in common. But there's also some kind of differences and departures that we do see here as well in your responses. So thank you everybody for, and feel free to continue putting them in there if stuff occurs to you while we're talking. And so I like to start this off with this quote that you see here by Bill Van Patten that says, communicative language teaching became a buzzword everybody thought they understood, but maybe really didn't. The outcome, communicative language teaching became whatever people wanted it to be. And I really like this because when I think about why there might be myths and misconceptions about something like communicative language teaching, I think this has a lot to do with it, which is that it's a very common term now. It's almost kind of common knowledge, a daily part of our vernacular as language teachers. Communicative language teaching is not necessarily anything new. It's been around for quite a while. And so sometimes I think once it becomes so common, it can kind of lose a little bit of the initial meaning that maybe it had when it was first introduced. And also that we as the teachers kind of impart our own style and our own ideas onto communicative language teaching as well, which is another thing in our introduction to make note of, is that today we're talking about a communicative approach, not the communicative approach. And I think this is really important just to take a quick minute to mention that, we're talking about communicative language teaching as an approach, as, a framework, and not necessarily a singular teaching method. And there can be many different teaching methods that kind of fall within a communicative approach that share different ideas and tenets. So things like task-based language teaching or project-based teaching, CI approaches, TPRS, ADI, kind of proficiency-oriented languages approaches. These might be all kind of different teaching methods, and they have things in common. And I'm not going to get into the nitty-gritty details of any of those specific approaches today, but kind of be talking a bit more holistically and generally about communicative language teaching. And I know that for myself, when I was a teacher, I kind of pulled specific techniques and tasks and styles and activities from these different approaches in my classroom. And I think that's also something that tends to be pretty common. Okay. So we're going to move into myth number 1, which is something that kind of goes with a lot of the comments that you guys were talking about. So I think this is great because a lot of you were having definitions that moved away from this myth. And so I think that's amazing, which is that the goal of communicative language teaching, or CLT, is to teach speaking. And so I have a little story for you all about my time. This was several years ago, and I was teaching a Spanish 1 course. This was during my graduate studies, and I was being observed by a fellow graduate student who was younger, newer in the program, and was taking a methods course at our university. And in the methods course, one of the assignments all the students had to do was they had to observe some language classes. And so she was in my class and was observing it. And my students were working in groups and pairs, and I don't remember exactly what they were working on, but I was walking around the classroom, checking in on them, and I noticed that the grad student observing me, she had her phone out on the table, and in the timer app was open on her phone. And so afterwards, when I checked in with her, I said, "Hey, I noticed you were timing something. Like, what were you doing there?" And she told me that she was timing the amount of time that my students spent speaking versus the amount of time that I spent speaking in the classroom. And I was like, "Oh, okay." But as the day moved on and the week moved on, that kind of didn't sit very well with me. And I thought, well, and I get why you're doing that, but it's also not necessarily indicative of a communicative classroom, because as we know, speaking is just one part of communication. And so to kind of continue with our definitions here, one way to define a communicative classroom is that communicative classrooms involve the expression, interpretation, and negotiation of meaning with a purpose in the context of the classroom. And so if we're talking about those 3 kind of activities as part of communication, expression, interpretation, and negotiation, of course we can do that via a spoken format, but we can also do that in a written format. If we are sending an email, if we are texting someone, this is also communication. And there are a lot of ways to communicate that don't involve language in this format at all. We can think about our facial expressions and gestures and body language, more broadly speaking, which is also a part of communication. And so we know that it's not just speaking equals communication. And a quick example, we could imagine these 3 activities as a sequence in a communicative classroom. And this is just to illustrate kind of the different ways that communication can be happening that don't necessarily involve speaking. And so we start off on the left-hand side, and students are doing this little reading here. So it's in an interpretive mode to get started. And they have to kind of read about these different people and animals that they like and that they don't like. And they're tasked with saying, "Do you agree with these opinions. And so students we have an expression, right, of meaning here in the written format, and students have to engage with it, interpret it, negotiate meaning. Maybe they don't understand some of these words. And they're doing that in order so that they can decide whether they agree. And that expression of opinion and agreement could take place in a spoken format, it could be in written format, or it could just be a reflection, and it doesn't necessarily get externalized anywhere. And then we move on to what is an interpersonal speaking activity. Students working in pairs, and they're taking a look at these sentences that we pulled out from this reading and trying to figure out what's going on here with some of the word endings. And then we move to the last activity in the sequence, which is for them to write about an animal that they like and one that they don't like and explain why. And so we can see that that initial reading that they did kind of serves as a model for this writing that they're going to do later. And so in this sequence of activities, which has a lot of communication happening, only kind of one of them necessarily could involve speaking. The other part with this myth is that speaking does not necessarily mean that communication is taking place. Just because words, right, are coming out of our students' mouths doesn't mean that they're having any communication. And so I've got a couple of examples to illustrate. And so here's this first one, and I just made this up, so it does not exist anywhere, but this is definitely a type of activity that I myself have done in the classroom several times, always with the best of intentions, right? So it says, get in pairs, take turns, and answer and ask these questions, basically. And so we have, again, the best of intentions. We think, oh, this is great. Our students, they're going to be working in pairs. They're going to be asking questions, answering questions. And, we're aiming for a simulated guided conversation to take place here when they're going back and forth here with this interaction. But for those of you who maybe have done activities similar to this, you might know kind of what happens in reality with students. And so I will demo that with myself here, kind of sillily, which is, I'm a partner with myself and I might say, hola, Sara, ¿consumes productos envasados? Sí, consumo productos envasados. ¿Y tú? Sí, consumo productos envasados. 2. ¿Siempre separas la basura para reciclar? Sí, siempre separo la basura para reciclar. ¿Y tú? And it just goes on that way. And so for those of you who don't speak Spanish, these are all yes/no questions. And I basically, say, I ask the question out loud and they say yes, and then they repeat everything in the question. And the students to do this activity don't need to understand any of these words. And oftentimes they don't, because they can read the question out loud. And if they've caught on to, a successful way to answer a yes/no question in Spanish is to say yes, and then just change the form of the verb from second person to first person, they've successfully answered this question, but they have no idea what they said. And maybe their partner doesn't even know what they said or even what they were asking. And so we can see that in terms of negotiating meaning, interpreting meaning, is not really happening there. Another example, this is also an activity that I myself have done so many times in my teaching career, because again, you think, awesome, we're setting my students up, this is going to be great. This is one of those activities where students are going to be walking around the room interviewing their classmates. They're going to have to find the person who does this activity. And so you've got a list of activities and then spaces for them to kind of sign their name. And, ideally we think, great, my students are going to go around. They're going to, ask somebody, do you sleep 8 hours every night? And this person's going to say, no, I only sleep 7 hours. And they're going to be like, okay, cool. And then they go find somebody else and they keep engaging in these conversations. They learn about their classmates, and they're using the language in this communicative way. But what often happens when you do this activity, or what I've experienced when I've done this activity, is that your students, they kind of just read whatever is written under the activity line. They maybe don't even make it into a question form. The person who they are asking usually just says yes. And then they sign their name, and they maybe don't know what they signed their name for. Sometimes other students don't even try, and they just point to the line and they sign, and they just kind of exchange papers and sign their names because they want to get the activity over with and sit down as fast as possible. And so then when you're kind of coming back together with your class at the end and you're like, okay, who sleeps 8 hours every night? And you say, Juan, who did you put down? And he said, I put down Maria. And then you're like, Maria, you sleep 8 hours? And she's like, no, of course not. And then you're like, but what happened there, guys? And so again, a lot of speaking might be happening, but maybe very little communication is happening in this type of activity. And so our question then becomes, well, how can we transform these activities, make minimal changes to them that set the pathway for these activities to be more communicative in the classroom with our students. And so returning to that first example of the back and forth Q&A, I actually wrote those questions out of this survey, which comes from Proyectos Dos, which is a book that I've taught with. And so we can see we still have questions here and we still have answers here, but now we are starting again in that interpretive mode where students are going to be reading the questions. We have multiple answers for each question, so there's more than one answer. There's not a right answer or a wrong answer in this case. And we also have this guiding question that is kind of the impetus. Why are we doing this? And it's asking them, do you think that your lifestyle is sustainable? Take this test and find out. So they answer these questions, they get their results. Then they're asked to say, do you agree with your results? And then they work with a partner and come up and brainstorm a list of kind of actions, things that they could do to reduce their carbon footprint. And so students here are forced into interpreting and negotiating with some meaning because they kind of want to get answers, right, that best represent who they are. They're going to be asked if they agree and why, and they're going to have to share that information with somebody else. And then you also know if, when you're saying, okay, great, what actions did you guys come up with? How can we reduce, our carbon footprint? And they say to you, well, I'm going to drive every day to school instead of taking the bus. And you say, well, that doesn't really make sense, right? And so there is this kind of need to engage on this kind of higher level of communication here versus just kind of repeating information back and forth. And then for our interview activity, here's kind of an adaptation for that. And this comes from Aula en Acción, and this is actually one of the final tasks that you do after one of the chapters. And I've also taught with this book and have done this final task with my students in class. And I always use it as an example because it was so great. And I really enjoyed doing it. My students enjoyed doing it, and I had really positive results with them. So that was amazing. But what we see here is different. Is again, we've got that guiding question on top. This one is saying, who is the person that kind of most engages in self-care? And our students are still going to be walking around the classroom, talking to each other, interviewing their classmates. But the questions here aren't necessarily yes/no questions, and it's eliciting information from their classmates. And so instead of just saying, yes, I do that, or no, I don't do that, it's asking them, well, how many hours do you sleep? How often do you engage in exercise? What time do you go to bed during the week? So the people being interviewed have to engage in some interpretation and negotiation because they have to provide an answer that makes sense, an answer that's logical. And the person doing the interviewing is also inclined to engage this way because they need to get good information from their classmates in order to answer this question. And then they get all the information, and then they're going to do a little bit of critical thinking here to determine, well, which of these three people, based on the information they've given me, would I pick is the most, one who engages in self-care the most, and then why? And then you, as you're reviewing, can see, okay, did the person that they pick make sense based on the information that they have? And that's kind of, that final check that comprehension and the negotiation and everything has gone through. And so these is just lists that I put together of some other tips, other ideas, things that you can kind of tack on or add to the end of some speaking activities or any type of activity really that you're doing with your students in class to help add that extra communicative piece to kind of help force the need for negotiation and interpretation of meaning in the classroom. So you can always ask your students if they agree or disagree and why with the information, right, that they're being presented in whatever format it may be in. They can do a ranking, they can pick top choices amongst options. You can ask your students to make a decision based on the information, to give a recommendation and why, to give their opinion, to determine something, right? Who is the best choice for something? They can provide a rating, find commonalities or differences, or provide a summary with some type of conclusions. And what all of these types of activities will allow you to do is what you see here. which is that, and this is kind of the conclusion for this myth, that for an event to be communicative, it must have a purpose that is not language related. And so, speaking just to speak is not necessarily communicative. And so as teachers, we can kind of add in these little extra activities, these extra little nudges to help our students engage in communication by saying, well, we're going to do something with this information with language that has nothing to do with language itself, right? So it's not practicing these Q&A because we need to practice using reflexive verbs in Spanish, or because I want to see if you can recall all this vocabulary, or go from the second person form to the first person form of certain verbs, but because we're going to understand this information and then we're going to do something with this information. We are now moving on to myth number 2, which is that communicative language teaching is not as rigorous as more traditional grammar approaches. And so as we kind of go into this myth, I have a question for you all, which is, what level of language proficiency does the typical student achieve in a high school world language program? So after about 4 years of study of high school Spanish or French or Chinese or German or whatever language it might be, where do they typically end up? So if anybody knows or has an idea or a guess and would like to throw it in the chat, go ahead and do so now. Yeah, we're seeing a little bit of a range, but I think most of you are hitting the nail right on the head here. So this particular study, which was done in 2010, found that after 4 years of study, most students are at the novice high or / intermediate low level. They're somewhere right around there. Obviously, we're going to have students that surpass that, but on average, right? And those are kind of the general results. And these results, I think, are also quite similar to studies that have been done in the post-secondary context, so in the college or university context, kind of after 4 semesters of study, or sometimes even after 4 years of college study. And this is where the proficiency level is. And so that number, or not that number, that level might be strikingly low to you, or it might be, yeah, that makes sense based on, your own teaching experience with your students. And so then the other question is, okay, well, what about if we're following a communicative approach? What happens there? Kind of what proficiency level do students achieve at the end of that study? And more and more research is being done, kind of looking at this specifically, kind of comparing different teaching approaches and styles, and also looking at using a measure of assessment in these studies that is communicative in nature, which is a very key element there when we're doing any research to answer these types of questions. So this is a very recent study. Actual did a book club on it last fall or earlier in this year. And so Hancock, Adams, and Casau, basically, they had 2 different groups of students, and one group was in a kind of a proficiency-oriented approach in a language classroom, and then the other group was in a more kind of traditional grammar-driven approach. And they had these students at the end of kind of, the experimental testing phase, take the APPLE, which is one of Actful's kind of measures of assessment towards proficiency tests that you can take. And they looked at students' scores in the interpersonal mode of this test. So kind of back and forth simulated conversation and speaking. And what they found is that students who were in that proficiency oriented, so that communicative group, demonstrated significantly higher scores than students that were in that traditional approach. And so specifically, we can compare students at that novice high, intermediate, low. So the exact level, which other studies have said, to intermediate mid. And so that might not seem like a huge difference, but it is kind of, a positive step in that direction that is showing that if your goal, your aim is for your students to develop communicative proficiency in the target language, and you are assessing in such a communicative way, that your classroom work in that communicative approach will get your students there, and that is successful. And so then the question becomes with this myth, well, if it's the case, in this particular study, for instance, as it's showing us that those who are in this proficiency communicative program are kind of getting farther along that path to proficiency, why do we have this belief maybe that exists that a traditional approach is more rigorous? Kind of where does that myth come from, or this idea come from? And I think it really has to do with what our perceived idea of rigor is. So kind of what that word means. And it's my impression, and I'm happy to see if you guys agree with me, so feel free to throw those in the chat as well, that curriculums, programs, classes are more rigorous if they have kind of right and wrong answers. And if we're able to tell students, you got this wrong, and so your grade is lower, right, than if you had gotten it right. It's kind of clear, black and white, one or the other. And that particularly, we also have the expectations of students being able to produce language without any errors. So when they produce language and it has errors, well, that was wrong. And so then they have a lower score than the ones who produce less errors. And kind of on the other side of that is, this idea that when we're using a proficiency rubric, so something that's holistic in nature, that the grades are inflated. And so we see, well, the grades are inflated. It's, this curriculum's not more rigorous. Students all have A's because, for whatever reason. Whereas in this curriculum, we see a range of grades, A's, B's, C's, and D's. What might that be? But, and we will keep in mind that it all really does have to do with our class goals and objectives as well. I'm kind of assuming, for the sake of our conversation today, that our class goal and objective for our students is for them, again, to build this kind of communicative competence in the target language. And so we can visualize this with an example of some rubrics, and I have another little hypothetical story to share with you. So the rubric on top is a rubric that I had to use at some point in my teaching career, and it was for written compositions. And the column on the left-hand side was rough draft, and the column on the right-hand side was final draft. And you can see that this is very kind of accuracy-driven, very error-driven. Students, the grammar section is out of 12 points, and you get 12 points if you make 2 or less errors. And then if you make 3 to 5 errors, you get 10 points. And then moving from the rough draft to the final draft, that range of the errors that you are allowed to make is smaller, because we assume that you took it home and did your work and kind of made it perfect and brought it back in. Versus the rubric that you see on the bottom, which is an example of a proficiency holistic style of rubric. We don't see any numbers about, errors here. It's on a scale of, exceeds expectations to approaches expectations. And we see language in those categories. For instance, under exceeds expectations, language resources, we can see it says use of practice grammatical structures with few errors and with efforts to create with the language. So the fact that students are going to produce errors is a part of exceeds expectations, where that's a very marked difference from the rubric above. And so now I want you guys to imagine that you are, well, you all most likely are language teachers, but that you have 2 students, and they've both turned in the same written composition. And so you're grading and you read them. And student A's composition is better than student B's. Right? That's you read it and you're like, oh, and if you were to directly compare them and had to pick one that's better, you'd pick student A. But student A's composition also has more errors than student B's composition. And so if you were to use the rubric on top to grade student A and student B, which is very error focused, very accuracy, maybe very rigorous, very, very strict, student B would probably get a better grade. And you might struggle with that. This is a hypothetical situation, but I have experienced this personally, where it's like, how do I give this student this grade, but this student this grade when this one's better than the other one, and struggled with the rubric and how to capture that. And most likely the reason that student A's composition reads as kind of better to you, more advanced, but also has more errors, is because student A is attempting to engage in linguistic risk-taking and some creativity. They're trying out the new words and new expressions and structures that you've been working on in class. Whereas student B is kind of maybe sticking with what they know. Some kind of basic sentences that they know are correct, that they know answer, the topic or whatever information that they had to provide, and they're not necessarily engaging in any risk-taking, attempting to kind of try out some new things. And so we want to be able to reward student A for engaging in that linguistic risk-taking, even though they're producing errors as they do so, because that's our ultimate goal, right? To move them down and help them develop their proficiency. And so with this holistic rubric, we can see that we can easier capture that distinction because it is specific to a proficiency level. So this is like a novice low rubric here. And so it says exceeds expectations is, practice grammatical structures, few errors, and efforts to create with the language. And so we're rewarding those efforts to create with the language because they are actually going above and beyond. They could just kind of stick with what they know, which student B did, which is not wrong. But this gives us kind of more range to play with there. And so if you have worked with proficiency or holistic-based rubrics, and can maybe have come up against this with colleagues or with friends or anybody saying, yeah, but grades are inflated and they're hard to use, and those types of comments, got some tips for you here. So first and foremost, we should always just keep in mind that our assessment should reflect the work that our students are doing in class and be a way to measure if our students are achieving the course goals and objectives. So if you're giving a, proficiency type holistic, like a project or something that they're doing and turning in, but your class has been very grammar focused, then there's kind of a little bit of a disconnect there, or vice versa maybe. And so we want to make sure that lines up. And then with these proficiency-based rubrics, we want to accept multiple avenues for success for our students. And that's one of the things that I like about them, is that they allow us to do that. They say success is not only always having the right answer. That's not your only path. There are multiple ways to success there, and I'm going to reward you for the different ways that you're finding. When it comes to those errors, and knowing, do I take points off? Do I mark it? Do I provide feedback? We can always come from that perspective of, does this error impede communication? And if you're, using a rubric that's at the novice low level, the idea of communication is are they comprehensible to somebody very familiar who's dealing with non-native speakers, so language teachers? And most of the time they're comprehensible to us, but every now and then, right, there might be scenarios where you're like, I really don't understand what my student is trying to say. We can also consider the proficiency level of our students, what we're asking them to do, and the resources that they had available to them at the time. So it's very different to ask our students to do something, impromptu in the classroom with no prep and no access to resources, versus saying, we're going to do this in class, but I'm going to give you time to prepare and you do have access to some resources, versus, something you ask them to do at home where they have all the time in the world and access to all the resources that they want. And then lastly, I would just kind of encourage everyone to not be afraid of that right-hand side of the rubric. Because if, you're always marking everybody on the left, you're always marking everybody in exceeds expectations, then your students have nowhere to grow. And that's what we want for them. We want them to be able to grow. And myth number 3, I think, is my favorite. I think this is maybe one of the most often talked about. It's very kind of pervasive in our language teaching kind of community, which is that communicative language teaching means you don't teach grammar. Or another way of thinking of this is that in a communicative approach, grammar is absent. And so I have another story for you all. Back several years ago, I was interviewing for some teaching positions, and I was in an interview. This was in person, and I had just done my teaching demo, where I, subbed 20, 30 minutes of a class, and they all watched me. And then we were, in the interview portion with the hiring committee. And so we were chatting about the teaching observation, and I asked something that I don't remember exactly the question, but something along the lines of, did what you see in my teaching demo, does that align with, the approach that you guys take here in this department, in your course goals and your curriculum goals? And the response that I was given was, we follow a communicative approach, so we don't teach grammar. End. And of course, when you're in an interview, you have to kind of weigh, right? You want to make a good impression. And so I chose to play it safe and to not ask a follow-up question to that response. But what I wanted to ask, and what if, there wasn't maybe that power dynamic at play there, that I would have asked was, well, what do you mean by that? When you say you don't teach grammar, what do you mean? What does teach grammar mean to you? Like, what does that look like for you in the classroom? And so I'm going to throw that question to all of you, which this is a loaded question, right? We're going to get a little meta for a second. And as a language teacher and as a linguist by training, I love talking about grammar. So we're going to take a minute to talk about it. So if you would be so kind to throw in the chat a definition or definitions. What is grammar? When we're talking about teaching grammar in a language classroom, what are we talking about here? What does this mean? So I'll give you guys kind of a minute to throw some ideas in there. So we're seeing a lot of patterns, structure. These words are kind of reoccurring in your definition. Rules to construct a language, a set of rules. Kind of structures in context, structures used to communicate a message, the way a language works, how the language is structured to communicate meaning. Yeah. Recognizing language patterns. Yeah. Using the language based on example patterns. Grammar is language itself. Observable patterns that can be recognized by people and used to learn, but not necessary. Yeah. I love it. Love it. Thank you so much, everybody. And again, feel free if other things occur to you. And the reason why I asked this question is because grammar, I think, is kind of like communication, which is one of those words where it's very common in our vernacular. And so we all kind of think we know what it means, and we do, but it is a word, a term, a concept that has multiple definitions. It can mean multiple things depending on, the context that we're in. And so I think the most traditional or stereotypical, if we want to frame it that way, definition of grammar, particularly if we're thinking about in a language classroom, is that it is a set of rules that we are able to kind of recall on command, or a set of pedagogical rules. And so we can think, I'm going to use an example from my first language, which is English. In English class, we were taught lots of rules about how the English language works. Very famous one, right? Which is that you cannot end a sentence with a preposition. Well, cool, that's a rule I can recognize. I can tell you that. And I know this is a rule of English, but does that rule capture the way that I use English? And I would say it doesn't really. I know for a fact I end sentences with a preposition all of the time. And for me, in a lot of cases, it is the default way of saying that, that it sounds better to me to end it with a preposition than to not end it with a preposition. And so, it's a rule of English. It's part of the grammar of the English, but there's that little disconnect there that it doesn't necessarily represent the way that I and probably millions of English speakers actually use the English language. So another way that we can think about grammar, and this comes from that linguistics background, and people who study, cognitively as a cognitive science, language itself, we can think of grammar as the rule-governed system that exists inside of our heads, that exists inside of our minds. It's the mental representation of language itself. And so, what these definitions have in common is that there are rules, of course, in both of them. Language is not random. But as a mental representation, maybe we're not able to recall all of the rules and how it's working as we are using our language. And so I think that's kind of an interesting distinction to make. And there are other ways that you can define grammar as well. But these are kind of just the two main ones that I'd like us to reflect on. And as we have these two definitions, and I think somebody even said in the chat, grammar is language itself, right? And I like that, because if it is our representation of language, it is language. Language is a grammar. So we have our definitions. My next questions for you are, is it necessary for communication? And can it be taught in a language classroom? Or the flip side of that, can it be learned in a language classroom? And so I think very much that the grammar of a language is an essential component in communication. That if I am communicating, if I am externalizing my language, whether that is by speaking, whether by writing or by signing, I'm using grammar. I'm using these rules that I have that help me put my language together, that help me structure, morphemes to make words to make sentences, that tells me how sounds should be pronounced when they're in combination with other sounds. But again, I might not be able to articulate those rules the same way I can my set of pedagogical rules that I learn in school. And so grammar is very much essential. It's necessary. If you're not using the grammar, you're not going to be able to communicate with language. But, and here's the big but, an adherence to total grammatical accuracy and mastery of a grammatical concept is not necessary for communication. So I have a couple of silly examples to illustrate. And if you have been a Spanish teacher, you will kind of roll your eyes at these. And my apologies to anybody who doesn't speak Spanish, just since Spanish teaching is my background, and the examples all come from my own experience, but I hope that you can kind of relate and extrapolate them to your own teaching experiences in different languages as well. So this first one here is very simple, very common. Students are introducing themselves and they say, me llamo es, and then their name. That S is not needed there, and it makes this sentence ungrammatical. Or they might say something like, ¿Cuál es la problema? Where problema, problem, is a masculine noun in Spanish, so it should be el problema. So these sentences are not grammatically correct, right? There's errors here. But I would say that in 100% of scenarios, these sentences are comprehensible. You're going to understand what your student is trying to communicate to you. If they say, me llamo es Sarah, then you know they're trying to tell me their name is Sarah. That error, doesn't cause any breakdowns in communication. Same way with la problema. And this brings me to a bonus myth, 3.5, which is that students learn what we teach them. And I think this can cause a lot of frustration, and it definitely caused frustration for me when I first started teaching, which is that thinking about the example, ¿Cuál es la problema? What is the problem with the error in gender agreement there? And you think, you know what? I have talked to my students about gender agreement in Spanish and how it works, and we've reviewed the exceptions to the rule that even though problema ends in an A, it's actually masculine and you need to use L. And, I've corrected this time and time again, and they keep making this error. Like, what's going on? Am I a bad teacher? Like, what's happening here? And the answer is that, well, when it comes to language acquisition and things like grammar, students don't necessarily learn what we teach them. That's not kind of how language acquisition works. So you can teach them until you are blue in the face about kind of these gender agreement rules in Spanish, but all of the research has shown that this is something that takes a very, very long time for learners to acquire, and to acquire to a degree of high levels of accuracy with it, especially in kind of unrehearsed, unprompted, spontaneous use of language. And so when we think about grammar, and, I'm telling you, this is a myth because grammar is very much a part of a communicative classroom because it's necessary for communication. The question then is kind of what is the role that it plays, and how should that look, and how does it look? But I think there's, more than one pathway there. And so to illustrate, here is a fake lesson that I just wrote. Again, this does not exist anywhere, but we can imagine it is one, kind of a brief version where you might say, today in Spanish class, we're going to learn the present subjunctive. And so first I'm going to start by introducing the present subjunctive to tell them what this is, that it exists. They don't know this. This is new information for them. We're going to review the conjugations, the forms, and then we're going to review the different uses. Then we're going to practice these different conjugations in these different usage scenarios. And when I feel that my students have achieved the level of accuracy that they need to, that they've understood this, okay, they got it, now we'll move on to using the present subjunctive in communicative context, maybe some pair work, Q&A types of activities that we've seen. And so some of you might be saying, well, wait, is she just trying to talk about the PPP, present, practice, produce model that might be familiar to you? And yes, that is intended, because I think that is tied into this idea that students learn what we teach them, so therefore we have to teach them. But as we've seen, particularly when it comes to grammar, and what research shows and tells us, is it doesn't work that way. And so what is a way that we could do this exact same lesson, but a little differently? And And so here you've got that example. And so again, this is one that I've done with my students. And so you can see that the lesson title is, present subjunctive. That's what we're focusing on. But now we're actually starting from that interpretive mode of communication again. So we're going to see the subjunctive in a communicative context first. That's our starting point. And we've got problems on the left-hand side and kind of solutions, recommendations on the right-hand side. And this is for students about, managing their time and stress and things like that. And that's kind of the context of this chapter. And so we see the subjunctive presented here in context, and students have to kind of relate which problem goes with which solution. So they have to interpret and negotiate a little bit here the meaning. But they maybe don't necessarily actually need the subjunctive. Like that doesn't play a role in that interpretation and negotiation of meaning. So what we do next is in activity 23, we're going to draw our students' attention to, hey, something new is happening here. And I actually really like the way that this is phrased. And it says, these verbs that you see, the ones in the dark yellow, are all found in the responses of the specialist. These are all in the responses of the recommendations and the solutions. And they're in this thing that's called the present subjunctive. And then it asks students to say, how do you normally see these verbs? Like, what do they normally look like when you see them? And so it's actually asking them to leverage, their previous knowledge and experience with present tense verbs in the indicative mode. And then their students are going to get together in pairs, take a look at it. They can consult, the rule chart in the book to see, did I get it right? We continue, we draw in 25, our students' attention to some more sentences. The ones that you see there in 1 through 4 are sentences pulled from the reading. And it's saying, well, there's something else that's happening here too. You have a couple different options. She's using actually 2 different linguistic structures to give recommendations and advice. Can you figure out when she uses which one? So this is kind of our little grammar aside to kind of focus on grammar that might be useful for us in this context. And then we continue, and students are then going to write their own problems and then share with the class, and they have to give advice and suggestions and recommendations to the students, the problems that their classmates put together. And so this is kind of the same lesson in essence, but structured in a different way to kind of really put at the forefront communication. So a way to teach grammar, but communicatively. And so again, some tips for teaching grammar in a communicative classroom. To always kind of start with that focus on communicative context and comprehensible input. So we want to be introducing grammar in a communicative context. That's actually our starting point instead of our ending point. And then there's other specific teaching methods and techniques, things like input enhancement, structured input, focus on form. And then there are also specific methods such as the PACE model, which outlines kind of a 4-step process to teaching grammar in a communicative way. And so those are all kind of different avenues that you could kind of take a look at. Myth number 4, this is related to kind of the bonus myth 3.5, which is that new structures and words must be taught before they can be used by students. And so I'm going to illustrate this with some examples. I think it's kind of the easiest way to understand what I mean by this. And so here we have an example of an activity for level 1, year 1 Spanish students, where it says, take a look at the pictures. Which activities do you like to do? And so we've got kind of a list of activities like eating chocolate, playing baseball, watching TV, listening to music, and some images to illustrate. And a lot of these words are cognates. And so I'm not expecting much difficulty from students in terms of, understanding these activities here. And then once they kind of go through, see the list, which ones they like to do, we move into part B, which is a listening activity. And they're going to listen to a recording of a character who was introduced earlier in the chapter, talking about what he likes to do and what he doesn't like to do. And he's pulling from this list of activities. So, part A also serves as kind of that pre-listening activity. And so you might see here in the zoomed in version that activity B specifically asks to say, ¿Qué le gusta hacer a Sebastián? ¿Qué no le gusta hacer? So what does Sebastian like to do? What doesn't he like to do? And this famously involves gustar in Spanish, which is one of those verbs that has, infamy about being difficult for students to understand and to kind of use accurately. And so you might be tempted, right? Or a teacher might be tempted when you're looking at this to say, oh, wait, well, before I can have my students listen to this recording and answer this question about what Sebastian likes and doesn't like to do, I have to tell my students about gustar. I have to introduce this word. They have to understand how it works. And so you might be tempted to stop, before you get there and introduce gustar and do some activities on it, play around with the conjugation, make sure that, they know that the le here is third person and that's referring to Sebastian in this context. But I would encourage you to look at it from a different perspective, which is that, well, do they actually need to know gustar in that detail at this moment in order to do this activity? And I don't think they do, because if I were to do this in class with my students, most likely, I would put up some kind of chart on the board or have my students write a chart, or, maybe we would use like whiteboards or mini whiteboards or something. And it would say, le gusta with a smiley face or thumbs up, and no le gusta with a frowny face and thumbs down. And students would just be inputting these activities that you see here in those two categories. So students are actually being, asked to process this idea of the concept of like and dislike, and then use these activities and are providing vocabulary expressions. They're not actually required to produce or to use gustar in any way, shape, or form and to do this specific activity. So you don't need to kind of take a stop and say, wait, before they can do anything with gustar, I have to teach it to them. You can actually come from this direction where you are exposing them to gustar in communicative contexts, in readings, in listening activities, in videos, in conversations, so that they've heard it, that they've seen it many times, right? Their brain, that grammar, that mental representation is already churning and is already working to figure out the rule of gustar before you even need to tell them what that rule might be. Another example, and this one comes from my personal experience, a conversation I've had with a colleague. So these are 2 pages in Proyectos Dos, and the page on the left-hand side comes before the page on the right-hand side. And my colleague was wanting to change the order of the pages in the textbook. And of course, as language teachers, we are doing what's best for our students and kind of building our curriculum. And of course, if you need to do that, you need to do that. But the reason why she wanted to kind of move the page on the right first is because of the box in blue, which I know is very tiny and fuzzy, so you can't read it. But it says, attention, you can refer to the future tense with the following forms. And then it gives them 2 options, habrá y tendremos. So in English, there will be and we will have. And students in this reading are talking about, what is education going to look like in the future? And they're asked to kind of sum up the main ideas about what that will look like in the future. And so it says, here are the 2 forms, the 2 verbs you need to talk about the future. And she looked at this and said, well, my students are being asked to use the future, so I need to do the activities that introduce them to the verb conjugations for the future and to practice that before they can do this activity. And I was like, well, do you though? Because again, what are your students being asked to do in this activity? They're being asked to provide content, information, phrases, expressions that they pull from this reading specifically. They're not necessarily being asked to produce verbs in the future, and especially not in multiple different conjugations. We give them the 2 that they need and they fill in kind of the content. And so the idea with this is kind of comes into that, if we think that students learn what it is that we teach them, we feel that we need to teach them before they can do activities and communication and readings and videos and listening activities that use those forms. And I would say, and sometimes that 100% is the case, but in other times, maybe not so much, that we can actually use, right, the communicative context, those readings, those listening, those videos, to be building that language proficiency all along. And so we don't have to wait. We don't have to wait to do the fun things with our students. We don't have to, hope that they gain mastery of a grammatical concept and need to be introduced to it before we can, ask them to view it, to listen to it, and to maybe play around with it and to experiment. All right, coming to our last myth here, which is myth number 5. And this is that communicative language teaching is student-centered, which equals an absent teacher. And so this can also connect back to that very first story I shared with you about being observed and having somebody time how much time I spent speaking in the classroom versus how much time my students spent speaking in the classroom. Because again, we might think, oh, well, student-centered classroom, the students should be speaking the majority of the time. But I think this kind of comes from this idea where, if we're aware that in a language classroom, students don't necessarily learn what we teach them, right? That's not how the process of language acquisition works. And if we're aiming for a student-centered classroom, then what is the role of the instructor? And so I've got kind of two quotes here for you that I will read. The first one says, "Instead, the teacher plays the role of a facilitator, negotiator of meaning, and provider of opportunities in which students can practice their speaking, listening, and reading skills in ways in which meaningful and authentic communication takes place." The second one says, "The teacher is thus the facilitator of students' learning, manager of classroom activities, advisor during activities, and a co-communicator engaged in the communicative activity along with the students." And you can see I've bolded here this word facilitator, because I think that is kind of the common word that is used when we're talking about a communicative approach and a student-centered classroom. We want to identify the teacher as facilitator. But what does that mean exactly, right? What is a teacher as a facilitator doing in the language classroom? And we all know that we're doing quite a bit of work, but it might look different, right, than what they expect teaching to look like in other class subjects. And so I wanted to kind of put a list together of kind of concrete things that the teacher as a facilitator in a communicative classroom is doing. And the first one on the list is that the teacher is the provider of comprehensible input to students, particularly, in those first years when they're at those lower levels of proficiency. A lot of times, the only language exposure that they get is from their teacher in that class. And we all know that comprehensible input is that key ingredient to language acquisition, that without it, language acquisition will not take place. And so this is a huge thing that teachers as facilitators, what we are doing in the classroom by speaking in the target language with our students is providing them that comprehensible input. At the same time, we are also co-communicators, because you're going to talk with your students. You're going to engage in some conversations. And, when these conversations happen in the target language, there is, those expression, negotiation, and interpretation of meaning are happening between you and the student. And that's the next one on that list, which is negotiator of meaning. So as you're talking to your student, maybe they don't understand everything that you're trying to say to them. And as teachers, we have a whole host of strategies that help us, rework it and communicate to our students and try and stay in the target language as much as possible. So we're modeling what negotiation of meaning looks like for students. And the students, same way, they might be saying something to us that we're like, what are you trying to say here? I'm not following. And so they have to kind of use those strategies, and we guide them in that negotiation of meaning. We also facilitate interactions between students. I think in a lot of cases, if we didn't force our students to work in groups and pairs and to speak the target language, that they would never do it. And so we're the ones facilitating that, so that as they grow, we as teachers are not the only provider of comprehensible input, but that their classmates, the other students, are also providing that comprehensible input to them, that they are co-communicators, that they have to negotiate meaning one with another as well. We also, as we saw when we were talking about grammar, we are a guide to direct our students' attention to essential elements of communication. Oftentimes, very kind of minute grammatical features, like verb endings, those things aren't necessarily noticed by students, especially like the subjunctive is not in a very salient place in the sentence. It's in the middle of the sentence. And in a lot of cases, it doesn't serve a communicative purpose on its own. So students might miss it entirely. Same way with gender agreement and things like that. So we're that guide to help direct students' attention to these things that are going to help them communicate and kind of making them grow and work on these elements as they progress through the proficiency levels. We provide a model of success to students in many ways. And then the last one on the list here is the curation of pedagogical tasks and the provision of scaffolding for student growth. And so this is also something, these activities don't exist in a vacuum. Teachers put them together, they build the curriculum, they make sure that, there's multiple modes of communication, that we're not just focusing on speaking, that students are also writing, that they're reading, that they're listening, that they're doing these activities to engage in some critical thinking and some, collaboration. And we provide scaffolding for students so that they can make their way, kind of down this path, right? I like to think of it as like your student needs to cross the river. And if they cross the river, now they're at the next level of proficiency, whatever that might be. And so we're helping them to provide the tools to be able to cross the river. We're showing them how to use those tools. We're providing opportunities for them to practice using those tools so that they can make their way across the river. And so to kind of wrap up here, some takeaways. These are some goals of communicative language teaching that kind of summarize the different points that we have talked about today, which is that we aim to make communication the focus of language learning, to provide opportunities for learners to experiment and try out what they know, to be tolerant of learners' errors, as they indicate that the learner is building up their communicative competence. We didn't talk about that too much, but errors can sometimes, as we talked about a little bit, that errors can be a sign of progress. And so we want to recognize that. We provide opportunities for learners to develop both accuracy and fluency. Link together those different skills, such as speaking, reading, writing, and listening, since they usually occur as such in the real world. And I really like that, where, as you can see in some of the examples where, we do a reading activity, and then there's a speaking activity, and then there might be a listening activity, and then a writing activity. And these different skills and modes of communication naturally flow and kind of go back and forth in our real life. And so we want to kind of emulate that if we can in the classroom as well. And then we aim to let students induce or discover these grammar rules as they're needed for communication along the way. And so that brings me to the end of my spiel, of my part. So we're going to move into the Q&A in a second, but if you have questions, love to hear them. And I'd also love if you have additional myths or misconceptions, things that you've experienced that you'd like to share. Like if we were to make a version 3.0 with a couple extra myths, what would you like to talk about? And so I'd love to hear that. And thank you so much, everybody, for your time. You can see here a couple of emails. If you have questions about the webinars, things like that, you can write directly to marketing@colettewl.com. And then you have my email here below, and I'll also put it in the chat. And then while you're thinking about potential questions you might have, or maybe myths and misconceptions that you would like kind of to bring to the table, I will take one more minute just to do a little plug for my job, which is that we call our KWL learning community. And so for teachers who work with us who are using our materials, we always offer kind of complimentary onboarding involving platform and issues about content implementation, where we talk about things like, what does the communicative approach look like in this series in particular? We have free webinars like this one and training sessions. We're always at lots of conferences and events, so we'd love to see people in real life that we've engaged with virtually. So please come and say bye. Sorry, say bye, say hi. Don't say bye yet. And then we do also offer paid continuing professional development. And so you can also check that out at our website if you or your school would be interested. And now I'm going to pass it over to Sabrina for the Q&A.
Thank you, Sarah, for that insightful presentation. We will now begin the Q&A session. Please continue to submit your questions through the Q&A feature, and we'll address as many as time permits. Okay, so far we have this question of, how do you understand the impact of AI on the learning of languages?
That is a heavy question, and I will preface by saying that I am absolutely in no way, shape, or form an expert on AI. So yeah, and I know that there are people, researchers who are doing, who have been working with systems, looking at like Google Translate, for instance, who are now incorporating AI into their research. And it's very interesting, and I'm very excited to see what they find about, how it can be incorporated in the classroom, and also students' reactions and uses to it. But not being an expert, I would say, and also no longer being a teacher. So for me, I'm not necessarily on the ground dealing with this with my students at the moment, but kind of thinking about if I were, I think that it's something that's probably not going away. So that that students are using, right? Whether we want them to use it or to not use it. And so I would, encourage everyone, including myself, to kind of look at it in terms of this is a tool and how can I use this tool to make my life easier? And so, and so that could be, I always think of it in terms of, I mentioned a couple of those ways that you can, tips to teaching grammar. And one of them is like structured input, which is, particular teaching method. And I don't know if AI is knowledgeable enough to do this. I'd have to test it out. But you could ask it and say, can you rewrite this activity so that it follows, the rules and guidelines of structured input and things like that to help it kind of enhance your lesson, to come up with additional examples for you and kind of use it to kind of supplement your teaching. And then, as AI improves, maybe we'll have scenarios in which, you can have students, and again, it's lots of factors there. But in an ideal world, right, the AI could also kind of engage in some interpersonal communication with your students. And so if, the AI asks them a question in Spanish and they have to respond in Spanish, and, I've engaged with enough, chat bots and things like that, that it will tell you, like, I don't understand. Can you please rephrase this? And so it can be a way to kind of maybe practice some negotiation of meaning, some expression of meaning. But again, I'm not an expert. And so those are kind of my 2 cents, but I do think it'll be something that we're going to see how it evolves. And hopefully it will make it easier for us as language teachers and not harder. I think it would be ideal. And that it helps us, to improve and to push students along, this communicative pathway. I think that would be the best result. That's what I'm going to be optimistic and hope for that.
Perfect, thank you. Now, the next question we have is if you recommend teaching in the target language from day one to start developing students' proficiency.
Yeah. So I definitely do. I know, and you might have heard, ACTFL has kind of that recommendation of 90% in the target language. And first year Spanish courses were some of my favorite classes to teach. Like I really enjoyed working with, the beginners or the almost true beginners. And I do think and believe that you can teach and do, facilitate the majority of your class in the target language. And of course, I'm also a believer that there is a time and place for English or for the shared language in your classroom as well. That a lot of times, at those beginning levels, if your focus is to test comprehension of something, then asking the comprehension questions in English is a good way of doing that. Because if you're asking them those questions in Spanish or whatever language you might be teaching, then you're kind of testing multiple things. Or if you're asking them to respond in Spanish, particularly, right, if you do a listening activity or a reading activity and then there's some comprehension questions, if you allow them to respond in English, then that is really showing, like, did they comprehend? And it's separating it from that factor of what they're able to produce in the target language as well. And then also you might want to have, if you're bringing in kind of content and themes of linguistic and social justice and that type of stuff, some of those conversations might also happen in the shared language earlier on. But I very much am a proponent of do as much of it as you can in the target language and hold that line, kind of draw that line in the sand and hold it. And that is very much a service that we as language teachers do for our students, is by saying, no, we're going to stay in the target language. And the benefits of that, you don't necessarily see right away, but they just kind of, they grow and they blossom. And then you're doing so much to help them build their language system that it's just kind of, the more you can do it, it really is very beneficial. So that's my 2 cents, but it is a lot of work. I will also acknowledge that if we're in a level 1 class and students are at that novice level, the amount of time that they can spend communicating with one another in the target language is not a lot of time, right? They're able to produce kind of chunked phrases and sentences. So at that level, as the teacher, the work you're doing is at a different level in terms of developing all of the scaffolding and the activities and the back and forth, versus in higher levels where you maybe can put them in groups for 5 minutes or so and they can kind of have a conversation. You need to kind of have more planned in those beginning levels to kind of maintain that target language use.
Perfect. And the next question we have is, how would you balance the need to establish a safe environment for errors versus the need to prevent fossilization of very common errors in a CLC?
Yeah, I think that's an excellent question and is sort of one of the challenges that we're always facing. And so the way that I visualize it and kind of think about it is that it should be a process that grows as the student's linguistic proficiency grows. And so, at the beginning, right, you're going to have less focus on accuracy, linguistic accuracy, than you will later. And so it's something that kind of progresses kind of throughout a single course, right, from the beginning of the year to the end of the year, but then also throughout, multiple courses. If we're imagining a student, going 4 years of Spanish or French or German or Italian or whatever language it might be. And so, the accuracy that you can require from somebody who's at the novice level versus the accuracy that you can require from somebody who's at, an intermediate mid or an advanced level is very different. And so I would kind of frame it that way as well in terms of, what level am I teaching? And these are my expectations. And then also by having students do different types of activities and assessments. And so I think, thinking about AI and technology, we aim to do a lot of assessments and type of work in the classroom so that we can, say, well, they did this themselves, right? They didn't get extra help and resources to do that. But then if that's the case, if we're not, giving them time to plan, if it has to be very spontaneous, they don't have any access to resources, there I would be a bit more, let's say lenient than if I said, okay, you have 20 minutes to prepare for this. You can maybe then be a bit more demanding in terms of grammatical accuracy if you've given them time to prepare, or if they have access to resources, and then also in the different modes as well. And so I don't have a very kind of concrete, this is it answer to this question, because I think it's something that will change depending on your students and your classroom and your context. But these are just kind of some ways that I would aim to structure it. And then I also have done activities with my students where I have, specifically drawn their attention to some repeated errors. And this kind of works if you have, older students or, once they get kind of a certain level where I say, okay, go through, I've given you feedback on, let's say, these 5 different activities, homework assignments, whatever it might be. And what are you seeing? What patterns do you see emerging? And so have them look and say, oh, wow, you keep correcting me and doing this, and I keep doing this. And you're like, yeah. And to kind of just drawing their attention to it and then kind of be pushing them more and more down the line, right? But at first, kind of, I think it's more important to foster that environment where they feel comfortable. If you want to talk in terms of crashing, right? Lowering that effective filter, making them feel like it's a safe space where they can try something new. They're not going to be made fun of, and they're not going to be punished for trying something new if they don't get it right. I think it's more important to lay that groundwork first. And then once that groundwork is kind of down and firmly in place and students are engaging in all of this stuff, then you can kind of work with them and kind of slowly over time become more demanding and kind of say, okay, this is, these are my expectations. This is where you need to be at, and kind of help them get there.
Perfect. Thank you, Sarah. And sorry, that seemed to be our last question. Thank you once again for participating in today's webinar. We hope you found it valuable, and please don't forget to check out our upcoming webinars and resources. Have a wonderful evening, and we look forward to seeing you soon again.
Thank you, everybody.